A lot of us do great technical work, but then we forget to tell a good story about how we got to the end result. And people don't get really excited about it because they don't quite understand the awesome work that we've done. Following a storytelling framework is a good way to set ourselves up for success by taking the audience through an engaging and emotional journey. Let's talk about this in more detail. One of the most commonly used storytelling frameworks is the so-called three-act structure. As you can see in this depiction of the structure, in Act 1, you set up the scene. In Act 2, you provide an escalation of the situation through obstacles and twists, and get the audience to a climax or a cliffhanger. Finally, in Act 3, you provide a resolution to the tension that you built up in Act 2. The bold dark line here is an abstraction of the emotional engagement of the audience as they hear your story. One important thing to notice is that Act 2 is the longer portion of the three acts. And if you think about your favorite movies or novels, you can probably notice that the initial setup and the final happy ending are generally relatively short. And most of the interesting things happen during the build-up in the middle. That's when the good storyteller can drag you with themselves through the journey. That's when all the tensions and confrontations happen, and how the resolution finds its meaning. Without a well set up Act 2, even the happiest endings don't feel that great because they lack context. Most of the art of storytelling is about providing the audience with the context and talking to them about the journey instead of just giving them the answers. Let's see how this works for product presentations. Before I begin, one important disclaimer up front is that storytelling is more of an art than a science. It's a creative process. So what I'm about to lay out is one of the ways of telling the story. Depending on your context and creativity, you might move things around a bit or shift your focus or emphasis on different parts. But as long as your story has the general structure and components that I will talk about, you should be good. First, you begin Act 1 by setting the context. Here you talk about what your project is and what the audience should expect. Then you move on to introduce your team and say what each team member has contributed. Then you set up the audience for the first encounter. Here, your goal is to introduce the problem, but instead of saying it in a matter-of-factly way, you do it in a slightly indirect way, but importantly in a way that makes an impression. For example, you talk about your ideal customer as a persona and what they are trying to achieve in life. Or you ask your audience to do something physical, like writing something down. Or you ask them to remember the last time they were trying to do something. The goal here is to engage them by helping them to relate to the problem. Remember that at this point you haven't told them what the problem is yet. You're just creating excitement about it. Then, instead of telling them the problem right away, you tell them to think about the hint that you just gave them and reflect on it. The goal here is to engage the imagination of the audience to get them closer to the problem. For example, if you got them to write something down, here you ask them to cross out some of the items on the list. Lastly, you get your audience to a climax by telling them about your epic meaning. Highlight a subtle but important point about what they should have noticed. Emphasize that this is a big deal by referring to the size of the problem that you have researched and discovered. Finish by hitting them with your mission statement. Most of the pieces of this climax is what you already worked on as the narrative for your problem statement. At this point, your audience is all ready and should know what you want to do and why you want to do that, and is ready to go on an emotional journey with you. In Act 2, your goal is to give the audience a glimpse of how you got to what you will show them at the end. First, you tell them how, based on the learnings from the research and discovery that you did, you plan the course of action. For example, you tell them about your market strategy. That is, how did you determine the small niche of users who are desperate to have your solutions, also known as early adopters. You tell them about your business strategy, or how you determine how much your early adopters are willing to pay. You tell them about your product strategy, or how you determine the quantitative success metric, what contributes to it, and what the current status quo is, and how you envision your product will change that. Then you tell them how you had to look for data and how you use that data to solve the problem. Then you went on to create a base model to just prove to yourself that this is possible and this can work. Then you deployed that model and did an alpha release. Talk about the architecture and the technology stack that you ended up using. And this was something that you had to come up with. It wasn't straightforward. Then comes the big twist. After your alpha release, your user feedback came in, and some part of it weren't exactly what you imagined. And that resulted in you having an aha moment. After that, you understood the problem much more deeply. And that helped you with better decisions about how to improve your product and increase the value that it provides to the user. Finally, at the climax of the story, you tell your audience how the user feedback was challenging some of your fundamental assumptions and how it looked insurmountable at first, but you continued going on and figured out what needed to change. Finally, in Act 3, it is where you give the audience the answers after all the build-up. You tell them the final architecture you ended up using, that fancy, state-of-the-art model you leveraged, and the interesting engineering hacks that you had to pull off. Then you show them the results you got and how the user was happy with that. Finally, you loop it all back to the first encounter. Remind the audience how now, with your solution, things are much better and the world is a better place. And of course, you tell them to check out your app, your GitHub repo, or any other place that you have the details. And that's how you present a deep learning-based application while you have your audience on the edge of their seats.